Love stories usually start with something magical, a chance meeting at a coffee shop, eyes meeting across a crowded room, or maybe a friend's introduction that changes everything. Mine started with Rachel dropping her grocery bags in the parking lot of Wilson's Market, sending oranges rolling everywhere. I remember thinking how beautiful she looked chasing after them, laughing at her own clumsiness. That's the thing about Rachel, she could make even the most ordinary moments feel special. I helped her gather the runaway fruit, and we ended up talking for almost an hour right there in the parking lot. She had this way of making conversation flow naturally, turning what should have been awkward small talk into something that felt like we'd known each other forever. That's when I first noticed her quirky side. She organized the rescued oranges by size before putting them back in her bag, explaining with complete seriousness that they get upset if you don't respect their hierarchy. That was 5 years ago. Now we're married, living in a cozy house in our small town of Cedar Creek, where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the biggest excitement usually comes from the seasonal festivals we hold in the town square. I work as an accountant at the local credit union, and Rachel runs a small bookstore downtown. It's not the most exciting life, but it's ours, and it's been perfect in its own quiet way. Rachel has always been the more adventurous one in our relationship. While I'm content with my routines and predictable schedules, she's always looking for new hobbies and interests. Over the years, I've watched her go through phases. There was the pottery phase, we still have dozens of slightly lopsided mugs, the urban gardening phase, our windowsills will never be the same, and the brief but memorable period when she decided to learn juggling. Only 3 lamps were harmed in the process. That's why when she first mentioned wanting to learn fishing, I didn't think much of it. It seemed like just another one of her phases, something that would keep her entertained for a few weeks before she moved on to the next interesting thing. Besides, living near Lake Cedar meant easy access to what many locals considered the best fishing spots in the state. It started small, like all her hobbies did. She bought a basic fishing rod from the sporting goods store and spent hours watching YouTube videos about different fishing techniques. Our coffee table became buried under fishing magazines, and our browser history filled up with searches about bait types and fish species. She'd practice tying fishing knots in the living room while we watched TV, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration, just like it did when she was really focused on something. I found it endearing, honestly. There was something sweet about watching her dive into this new interest with such enthusiasm. She'd share random fishing facts during dinner, her eyes lighting up as she explained the difference between various types of lures or the best times of day to catch specific fish. Even though I didn't understand half of what she was talking about, I loved seeing her so passionate about something. Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs. The way she'd get oddly defensive if I asked too many questions about her fishing spots. How she never brought any fish home despite claiming to spend hours at the lake. The mysterious phone calls she'd take outside, speaking in hushed tones about perfect conditions and special techniques. But hindsight is always clearer than the present, isn't it? And when you trust someone completely, you don't look for hidden meanings in their words or secret agendas in their hobbies. You just accept things at face value and feel grateful to have someone who makes life interesting. If only I'd known then what I know now. But I guess that's how these stories always go. You never see the storm coming until you're already caught in the rain. Rachel's fishing hobby started taking up more and more of her time as spring rolled into summer. At first, it was just Wednesday evenings she'd head out to the lake right after closing the bookstore, saying the sunset hours were prime fishing time. I didn't mind. I used those evenings to catch up on work or watch the shows she didn't particularly enjoy. Then came the Saturday morning trips. She'd wake up before dawn, quietly packing her gear while I was still half asleep. "The fish bite better in the morning," she'd whisper, kissing my forehead before heading out. I'd wake up properly a few hours later to find a sticky note on the coffee maker with a little heart drawn on it, and sometimes a reminder to water her herb garden. I remember the first time I really noticed something changing. It was during one of our regular Sunday brunches at May's Diner, a tradition we'd kept since our second date. Rachel was telling me about a new fishing technique she'd learned, something about using different colored lures depending on the water's clarity. Normal enough, except her phone kept buzzing with text messages, and each time it did, she'd glance at it quickly and turn it face down on the table. "Popular today?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, just a fishing forum," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Everyone's excited about the weather conditions. Apparently it's perfect for bass." I nodded and took another bite of my pancakes, but something felt off. Rachel had always been an open book, the kind of person who'd share her phone password freely and read funny texts out loud. This new secretiveness, however small, felt like a tiny stone in my shoe, not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore completely. The changes continued, subtle but steady. She started taking more care with her appearance before her fishing trips. Don't get me wrong, Rachel had always been well put together, but suddenly she was putting on makeup to go sit by a lake for hours. Her fishing outfits got nicer too, no more old t-shirts and worn jeans. Instead, she bought what she called proper fishing attire, neat cargo pants and moisture-wicking tops in flattering colors. "It's about sun protection," she explained when I commented on a particularly nice new fishing jacket. "Plus, there's this whole community of fishing enthusiasts at the lake. You want to look professional, you know?" I didn't know, actually. My knowledge of fishing fashion was exactly zero, but I nodded along. After all, Rachel had always been the kind of person who threw herself completely into her hobbies. If she said fishing had a fashion scene, who was I to question it? Our friends started noticing the change too. During a barbecue at Tom and Sarah's place, Sarah pulled me aside while Rachel was showing everyone pictures of her, almost catches, on her phone. "She's really into this fishing thing, huh?" Sarah said, giving me a look I couldn't quite read. "Yeah, you know Rachel, when she finds something she likes, she goes all in." Sarah nodded, but there was something in her expression concerned, maybe? Or was I just starting to see things that weren't there? Before I could ask what she was thinking, Rachel called us over to look at a photo of a sunset over the lake, and the moment passed. The thing about change is that it's like watching a pot of water heat up. At first, nothing seems to be happening at all. Then you start to see tiny bubbles forming at the bottom. They're easy to dismiss, maybe they've always been there, maybe it's nothing. But then more bubbles appear, and before you know it, the whole pot is boiling. I wasn't ready to admit the water was heating up yet. After all, this was Rachel, my quirky, adventurous, completely transparent wife. The woman who still organized oranges by size in our fruit bowl and left me silly notes on the coffee maker. If something was really wrong, surely I would know. Besides, summer was coming, and with it, Cedar Creek's biggest event of the year, the annual Fish Fry Festival. Rachel was talking about entering the competition, and her excitement was contagious. How could anything be wrong when she was so happy? If only I'd paid more attention to those tiny bubbles. Summer was in full swing, and Rachel's fishing trips had become so regular you could set a clock by them. Wednesday evenings, Saturday mornings, and now even some Sundays, though she always made it back in time for our brunch at May's. What started to bug me wasn't the time she spent fishing, it was the fact that despite all these hours at the lake, we never seemed to have any fish to eat. "I'm practicing catch and release," she explained one evening when I brought it up. "It's better for the ecosystem." That made sense, I suppose, though I remembered how excited she'd been initially about cooking her catches. She'd even bought a fancy cookbook called Lake to Table, that now sat gathering dust on our kitchen shelf. It was around this time that I started going to Gary's fish market more often. Gary had opened the place about 5 years ago, and it had quickly become known as the best spot for fresh fish in Cedar Creek. If Rachel wasn't bringing home any fish, I figured I could at least cook some nice seafood dinners for us. Gary was an interesting character, the kind of guy who seemed to know everything there was to know about fish. Tall, weathered-looking, with the kind of tan you only get from spending countless hours outdoors. He always wore these fishing shirts with about 1,000,000 pockets, and he had this way of talking about fish that made it sound like he was letting you in on the world's biggest secrets. "The secret's in the timing," he told me one day as he wrapped up some salmon. "You've got to know exactly when and where to find the best catch. It's like a dance, really." I noticed he had quite a following among the local fishing enthusiasts. There were always people hanging around his counter, asking for advice about bait choices or the best spots on Lake Cedar. He seemed to enjoy the attention, holding court from behind his display of ice-packed fish, sharing what he called his fish wisdom. Rachel never came to the fish market with me. When I mentioned buying something from Gary's, she'd get this strange look on her face and quickly change the subject. I figured maybe she felt weird buying fish when she was spending so much time trying to catch them herself. Still, something about her reaction nagged at me. One Wednesday evening, while Rachel was out fishing, I decided to try recreating one of the recipes from her abandoned cookbook. I headed to Gary's about an hour before closing time, hoping to get some fresh trout. The market was quiet, with just a few customers milling around. Gary wasn't at his usual spot behind the counter. He's out back. His teenage assistant told me. Should be back in a few minutes. He always goes to check on his special stock around this time. I waited, absently looking at the photos on the wall behind the counter. They showed Gary in various fishing spots, holding up impressive catches. One photo caught my eye. It showed Lake Cedar at sunset, taken from what looked like a perfect fishing spot. The location seemed vaguely familiar, like somewhere Rachel had mentioned, but I couldn't quite place it. When Gary returned, he seemed slightly rushed, less chatty than usual. His shirt was wrinkled, and there was a faint smell of perfume mixed with the usual fish market smells. I didn't think much of it at the time. When you're not looking for something specific, it's easy to dismiss little details that later seem so obvious. That night I made grilled trout with herbs from Rachel's garden. When she came home, her cheeks flushed from what she said was the evening wind. She seemed surprised by the dinner. "This looks amazing," she said, but she picked at her food more than ate it. "I'm sorry, I think all that time around fish today has ruined my appetite." I wrapped up the leftovers, trying not to feel disappointed. As I was cleaning up, I noticed Rachel's fishing jacket hanging by the door. It smelled faintly of fish market rather than lake water, but I told myself it made sense. Fish smells like fish, whether it's in a market or a lake, right? Looking back, I realize I was working pretty hard to explain away things that didn't quite add up. But when you trust someone completely, you become an expert at finding reasonable explanations for unreasonable things. It's amazing what we can convince ourselves of when we're not ready to face the truth. Cedar Creek's summer fishing season was in full swing, and suddenly it seemed like everyone was talking about fishing. The local coffee shop started hosting weekly fishermen's mornings, where people would gather to discuss techniques and share stories. Rachel never missed one, though she'd specifically asked me not to come along. "You'd be bored," she said, adjusting her hair in the mirror one morning before heading out. "It's all technical talk about lures and water temperatures. Besides, you need your Saturday morning sleep." She had a point. I couldn't tell a bass from a bluegill if my life depended on it. Still, something felt off about being explicitly uninvited from my wife's new social circle. Rachel had always wanted to share everything with me before, even her most obscure interests. I still had a shelf full of pottery books from her ceramics phase to prove it. The town was gearing up for its annual fish fry festival, and this year seemed bigger than ever. Maybe it was because of Gary's influence. He'd been appointed head judge for the competition portion, and his enthusiasm was infectious. The local paper ran a feature about him, dubbing him the salmon whisperer of Cedar Creek. The article mentioned his uncanny ability to always have the freshest fish, no matter the season. "It's all about knowing where to look," he was quoted saying, "and having a special connection with the water." Rachel had cut out the article and pinned it to our fridge, right next to our wedding photo. When I asked her about it, she mumbled something about good fishing tips, and quickly changed the subject. One evening, I ran into Sarah at the grocery store. She was picking up supplies for another neighborhood barbecue, and we got to talking about Rachel's fishing obsession. "You know," Sarah said, examining a bunch of tomatoes, "I drove by the lake last Wednesday around sunset. Thought I might see Rachel there, maybe wave hello." She paused, putting the tomatoes in her cart. "Funny thing is, I didn't see her usual spot occupied at all. She probably found a better location." I said, but something in Sarah's tone made me uncomfortable. You know how serious she is about finding the perfect fishing spots. Sarah gave me that same concerned look I'd seen at the barbecue. Yeah, probably. Hey, have you met any of her fishing friends? Tom and I would love to have them over sometime. I realized then that I hadn't met a single one. Whenever I asked about the people she fished with, Rachel would give vague answers about just folks from around town, or people you wouldn't know. For someone who spent so much time with this community, she was surprisingly reluctant to introduce me to any of them. The next day, I decided to surprise Rachel by bringing her lunch at her bookstore. She'd mentioned having to work through lunch to catch up on inventory. But when I arrived, her assistant Jenny was manning the counter alone. Oh, Rachel's at a fishing workshop, Jenny said brightly. She said it was a last-minute thing. Some expert giving a demonstration on advanced techniques. I stood there holding the sandwich I'd brought, feeling slightly foolish. Did she say where? Jenny shook her head. Just that it was important, and she'd be back by closing time. On my way back to work, I drove past Gary's fish market. His truck wasn't in its usual spot, and the "back in 30 minutes" sign hung on the door. Probably just a coincidence, I told myself. Lots of people could be giving fishing workshops. That evening, Rachel came home later than usual, full of excitement about the workshop. She talked about new knots she'd learned and special seasonal patterns in fish behavior. I noticed she had changed clothes since morning, and her hair was different too, more styled than how she usually wore it to the bookstore. Must have been quite the workshop, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Oh, you know how it is with these things, she replied, busying herself with making tea. You get so caught up in learning, time just flies by. I didn't know how it was with Rachel and her hobbies, or at least, I used to think I did. But this felt different somehow. In the past, her enthusiasm had always been accompanied by a desire to share every detail with me. Now it seemed like each new fishing adventure came with a fresh set of reasons why I couldn't be part of it. That night, I lay awake long after Rachel had fallen asleep, listening to the summer crickets through our open window. I found myself wondering what a real fishing workshop would look like, and why my wife, who used to share everything with me, now had a life I wasn't welcome to be part of. After that night of lying awake and wondering, I started paying more attention to the little things. It's funny how your perspective can shift once doubt creeps in. Things that seem perfectly normal before suddenly take on new meanings, like watching a familiar movie and noticing all sorts of details you missed the first time around. I started keeping a mental log of Rachel's fishing schedule, noting how it always seemed to coincide with Gary's mysterious absences from the fish market. But every time my mind wandered into suspicious territory, I'd feel guilty. This was Rachel we're talking about, the same woman who still left me sticky notes with silly drawings, who organized our spice rack alphabetically, who cried during pet food commercials. One morning, while Rachel was at another fisherman's morning meeting, I decided to do some research. I pulled up the local fishing regulations website, thinking I might learn something about these techniques she kept mentioning. Maybe if I understood more about fishing, I could be part of her new world. 2 hours later, I had learned that most of the terms Rachel casually threw around in conversation didn't quite match up with real fishing terminology. She'd talk about reverse casting and depth scanning, like they were common practices, but I couldn't find any mention of them in fishing guides or forums. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe these were local terms, or new techniques I just couldn't find online. Rachel had always had her own way of describing things she still called our coffee maker, Mr. Beans, and referred to parallel parking as puzzle parking. The next Wednesday, I left work early, thinking I might drive by the lake. Not to spy on Rachel, I told myself, just to see what this fishing community was all about. Maybe wave hello if I spotted her. It took me a while to find the spot she'd described as her favorite, a quiet cove on the lake's northern shore. The evening was perfect for fishing, according to everything Rachel had told me about ideal conditions. The water was calm, the sun was starting to set, and there was just enough cloud cover to keep the heat manageable. But when I got to the spot, I didn't see Rachel's car in the small parking area. In fact, I didn't see anyone fishing at all. I parked and walked down to the shore, feeling increasingly uneasy. The spot was beautiful, I had to admit that. Someone had even set up a comfortable-looking bench overlooking the water. A few fishing hooks and bits of line were scattered around, evidence that people did fish here. But no Rachel. On my way home, I passed Gary's fish market. His truck was gone, and the "back in 30 minutes" sign hung on the door, just like the other times Rachel had her fishing trips. I sat in my car for a while, staring at that sign, trying to convince myself that all these coincidences had perfectly innocent explanations. When Rachel came home that evening, she was full of stories about the fish that had gotten away, about the perfect conditions at the lake, about all the other people who had been there. I listened, noting how she never mentioned specific names, how her descriptions of the lake didn't quite match what I'd seen. "You should come with me sometime," she said suddenly, catching me off guard. "I mean, you probably wouldn't enjoy it, but the offer's there." It was the first time she'd invited me along in weeks, and something about her tone made me think she knew I wouldn't accept. She was right, I made some excuse about work being too busy. That night, I found myself going through our recent credit card statements. Rachel had always managed our shared card, being better with day-to-day budgeting than me. Looking at the statements now, I noticed something odd. There were regular charges from the local sporting goods store, which made sense given her hobby. But there were also frequent charges from a place called Lakeside Supplies that I'd never heard of. I tried looking up Lakeside Supplies online, but couldn't find any business by that name in Cedar Creek or the surrounding towns. Another coincidence to add to my growing list. The next morning, Rachel was humming while making coffee, seemingly without a care in the world. She kissed me goodbye, reminded me to water her herbs, and headed off to the bookstore like it was just another normal day. I watched her car pull away, wondering when exactly I'd started doubting every little thing about my wife's life. The Fish Fry Festival was just a few weeks away now, and Rachel had started talking about entering the competition. She mentioned something about having a special technique she wanted to show off. Gary, as head judge, would surely appreciate it, she said with a smile I couldn't quite read. I stood in our kitchen, holding my coffee mug, staring at Gary's newspaper article on our fridge. The Salmon Whisperer smiled back at me from the photo, and for the first time, I really looked at the background of the picture. It showed the exact same bench I'd seen at the lake the day before. The discovery of Gary's photo location kept me up most of that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't ready to face. The next morning, over breakfast, I watched Rachel getting ready for another Saturday fishing trip, noticing things I'd somehow missed before. She wasn't just dressing nicely, she was dressing up. The moisture-wicking tops were actually designer shirts that would cost a fortune to replace if they got fish guts on them. Her practical fishing pants looked more suited to a fashion magazine than a lakeside adventure. Even her hair was perfectly styled, complete with waterproof hairspray that I'd found the receipt for in her car. "I might be late today," she said, applying a fresh coat of lipstick. "There's a special fishing seminar about seasonal patterns." "At Gary's?" The words came out before I could stop them. Rachel's hand froze for a split second, the lipstick hovering near her mouth. "No, at the lake." "Why would you think it's at Gary's?" "Just wondering," I said, trying to sound casual. "Since he's the fishing expert around here." She finished applying her lipstick with a steady hand, but I noticed she wouldn't meet my eyes in the mirror. "Lots of people know about fishing in this town. Gary's just the most vocal about it." After she left, I sat at our kitchen table, staring at my cold coffee. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. On impulse, I walked to our home office and opened Rachel's desk drawer, something I'd never done before. We'd always respected each other's privacy, but I figured those rules had changed when the trust began to crack. Inside, I found a stack of receipts from Gary's fish market, dated on days when Rachel was supposedly fishing. Each one was for a significant amount of fish, enough to feed a family for days. But we hadn't eaten fish at home in weeks, except for what I'd bought myself. Below the receipts was a small notebook. Rachel had always kept notebooks for her hobbies, detailed records of her progress and lessons learned. This one was different. Instead of fishing notes, it contained what looked like recipes. But not just any recipes, they were Gary's recipes. His secret brining method, his special seasoning blends, all written in Rachel's neat handwriting with little hearts dotting the I's. My hands were shaking as I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I needed air. Grabbing my keys, I headed to the one place I knew I could get some straight answers: Sarah's house. Sarah opened her door with a knowing look, as if she'd been expecting me. Finally figured it out, huh? I don't know what I figured out, I said, following her into her kitchen. I just know something's wrong. She poured us both coffee and sat down across from me. Tom and I have been worried. We've seen them, you know. At the lake. Them? Rachel and Gary. They're not exactly subtle about it anymore. Half the town has seen them together, but nobody wanted to be the one to tell you. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We thought you must know, must be choosing to ignore it. Tell me everything, I said, and Sarah did. Apparently, Rachel and Gary's fishing lessons had been the talk of the town for weeks. They'd been spotted at various locations around the lake, always looking very cozy and definitely not fishing. Gary's special stock? The fish he mysteriously always had fresh? He was having them shipped in from a supplier in the city, not catching them himself. The whole salmon whisperer thing is just good marketing, Sarah explained. But Rachel, she fell for it completely. Or at least that's how it started. I listened as Sarah filled in the blanks: how Rachel had first gone to Gary for actual fishing advice, how he charmed her with his knowledge and attention, how their lessons had gradually become something else entirely. The fishing community I'd never been allowed to meet? It didn't exist. The workshops and seminars? All covers for their time together. The Fish Fry Festival is in 2 weeks, Sarah said carefully. Word is, they're planning to use it as some kind of coming out party. Gary's wife left him last month, moved to her sister's in Oregon. Rachel probably thinks. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against Sarah's kitchen floor. I need to go. What are you going to do? Sarah called after me as I headed for the door. I don't know yet, I said. But I'm done being the only one in town who doesn't know what's happening in my own marriage. As I drove home, my mind was racing with possibilities. The Fish Fry Festival was supposed to be Rachel's big debut in the fishing world. Well, maybe it was time for me to take up fishing too. After all, how hard could it be to catch something if you knew exactly where to look? After leaving Sarah's house, I drove around town for hours, my mind churning with everything I'd learned. Every street seemed to hold some memory of Rachel: the park where we'd had our first picnic, the bookstore she'd turned into her dream business, the coffee shop where she still left notes, and my favorite mug when she opened the store early. But now those memories felt tainted, like old photographs that had been exposed to light for too long. How many of her early mornings at the bookstore had really been meetings with Gary? How many of her excited fishing stories had been carefully crafted lies? I ended up parked outside Gary's fish market, watching customers come and go. From my car, I could see the famous article about him still displayed in the window. The Salmon Whisperer, what a joke. A man who bought his fish from city suppliers and pretended to catch them himself, who built his reputation on lies and charm, who thought nothing of destroying someone else's marriage. That's when the idea started forming. If Gary could build a business on fake fishing stories, maybe it was time for some real ones to come out. The Fish Fry Festival was Cedar Creek's biggest event of the year, drawing people from all the surrounding towns. Gary, as head judge, would be center stage. Rachel would be there too, probably planning to show off her non-existent fishing skills. Perfect. I spent the next few days researching everything I could about the festival. It turned out anyone could enter the competition. You just had to bring a fish dish and present it to the judges. The rules were pretty loose, focusing mainly on food safety and presentation. There was even a category for creative interpretations, of traditional fish dishes. When Rachel asked about my sudden interest in the festival, I shrugged it off. Just wondering what all the fuss is about, I said while she packed her fishing gear for another seminar. I started making calls. The first was to my cousin Mike, who worked in special effects for local theater productions. The second was to a guy he recommended, someone who specialized in custom props and pranks for events. The third was to a printing shop 2 towns over, where nobody would recognize me. You want what? The prop maker asked when I explained my idea. A fish, I said. A very special fish. One that can tell stories. He was quiet for a moment. This isn't going to hurt anyone, right? Not physically, I assured him. Just some truths that need to come out. While waiting for my special order, I kept up appearances at home. Rachel was so caught up in her own deception that she didn't notice anything different about my behavior. She continued her fishing trips, coming home with elaborate stories about the ones that got away. I nodded and smiled, all while knowing exactly where she'd really been. I did make one trip to the real lake, not the romantic meeting spot Rachel and Gary had turned it into. I sat on that famous bench and watched actual fishermen casting their lines into the water. They made it look so easy, so peaceful. I could almost understand why Rachel had been drawn to the idea of it. But she'd never really given fishing a chance, had she? She just used it as a cover story for something else entirely. The prop maker called 3 days before the festival. It's ready, he said. And man, this is some of my best work. You sure you want to go through with this? Absolutely, I said, thinking of all the nights I'd laid awake, all the lies I'd discovered, all the pitying looks I must have been getting around town for months. Sarah caught me leaving the prop maker's workshop. She'd followed me, worried about what I might do. Don't do anything crazy, she pleaded. Maybe you should just talk to Rachel? I showed her what I'd had made. Her eyes widened, then she let out a low whistle. Okay, that's actually pretty brilliant. Evil, but brilliant. Not evil, I corrected her. Just creative. Like Gary's marketing. The day before the festival, I watched Rachel pack her entry for the competition, some complicated fish dish she claimed to have learned from other fishermen. I knew now that it was probably one of Gary's recipes, copied from that notebook I'd found. She was humming while she worked, seeming almost giddy with excitement. Big day tomorrow, she said, catching me watching her. Are you coming to watch? Wouldn't miss it, I replied, thinking of my own special entry waiting in the garage. I have a feeling it's going to be quite a show. That night I barely slept. Not from guilt or fear, but from anticipation. Tomorrow, the whole town would gather for Cedar Creek's biggest event of the year. Gary would be there in his element, playing the expert fisherman. Rachel would be there, ready to show off her supposed skills. And I would be there too, with a very special fish that was about to make quite a splash. The morning of the Fish Fry Festival dawned bright and clear, as if even the weather was conspiring to make this day memorable. The town square was already buzzing with activity when I arrived, carrying my special entry in a large cooler. Temporary stalls had been set up in a circle, each one decorated with fishing-themed banners and streamers. The air was thick with the smell of fried fish and the sound of excited chatter. I spotted Rachel almost immediately. She was standing near the judges' table, deep in conversation with Gary. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. She was laughing at something he'd said, touching his arm in that familiar way that made my stomach turn. Neither of them noticed me as I set up my station 3 spots down from Rachel's. Didn't know you were entering, Sarah said, appearing at my elbow. She was working the registration table, checking in contestants. Are you sure about this? I nodded, watching as Gary made his way to the judges' table, straightening his official judge badge with obvious pride. He looked every bit the part of the respected local expert, greeting people with that confident smile that had probably helped him sell countless fish over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Thompson's voice boomed over the speaker system. Welcome to Cedar Creek's 43rd Annual Fish Fry Festival. This year, We have a record number of entries and some very special guests judging the competition. I tuned out the rest of his speech, focusing instead on making sure everything was perfect with my entry. The prop maker had outdone himself. The stuffed catfish looked amazingly realistic, its skin glistening under the morning sun. Inside, carefully hidden, was the small speaker that would turn this festival into something the town would never forget. Rachel was busy arranging her dish, some elegant-looking fish creation that I was sure came straight from Gary's secret recipe collection. She kept glancing at the judges' table, particularly at Gary, who would occasionally catch her eye and smile. It was like watching a play where only I could see the strings controlling the puppets. The judging began with the traditional categories: best fried fish, most creative use of local catch, best presentation. I waited patiently as the judges made their way around the circle. My entry was registered in the creative interpretations category, scheduled to be judged last. Finally, it was my turn. Gary approached my table, flanked by the other judges. He barely glanced at me. I was just another contestant to him, not worth remembering as the husband of the woman he'd been seeing behind my back. "And what do we have here?" he asked, his voice carrying that practiced authority he used to impress his customers. "Just a simple stuffed catfish," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I call it the truth teller." Gary raised an eyebrow, probably thinking I was making some attempt at artistic symbolism. He leaned forward to examine the fish more closely, exactly as I'd hoped he would. That's when I pressed the hidden button in my pocket. The fish began to speak, and the sound that came out was unmistakably Gary's voice, mixed with Rachel's. "Gary, you're so salty. It's the brine, babe. It's all in the brine." The crowd went silent. Gary straightened up so fast he nearly knocked over my display. Rachel, who had drifted closer to watch the judging, froze in place, her face draining of color. The recording continued, playing snippets of conversations I'd gathered over the past week, following them to their not-so-secret meeting spot by the lake. Their discussions about deceiving me, about Gary's wife, about their plans to reveal everything after the festival, it all came pouring out of the mechanical fish's mouth in their own voices. "Gary, I've never tasted fish like yours before." "Well, babe, you're my biggest fan, my only fan." Someone in the crowd laughed, a short, shocked sound that broke the tension. Then more laughter followed, mixed with gasps and whispers. People were starting to put it all together: the salmon whisperer's mysterious fresh fish, Rachel's sudden fishing expertise, all of it unraveling in front of the entire town. Gary's face had turned an interesting shade of red. He reached for the fish, probably planning to silence it, but I'd anticipated that. The prop maker had made it virtually indestructible, and the speaker was well protected inside. "What's wrong, Gary?" I asked loudly. "Don't you want everyone to hear about your special fishing techniques?" The chaos that followed my revelation was something straight out of a small-town drama. The festival's carefully organized atmosphere dissolved into a mix of shocked gasps, nervous laughter, and the rapid-fire clicking of phone cameras. My talking fish continued its performance, broadcasting Rachel and Gary's private conversations across the town square, each word landing like a stone in still water, creating ripples of reaction through the crowd. Rachel stood frozen, her perfectly styled fishing outfit suddenly looking as fake as her hobby. Her face had gone through an impressive range of colors from ghost white to burning red, finally settling on a sickly pale shade that matched the stuffed fish's belly. Several times she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Gary, on the other hand, tried to maintain his dignified judge persona for about 30 seconds before cracking. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his weathered fisherman's tan now splotched with angry red patches. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but dash." "Game?" I interrupted, raising my voice just enough to be heard clearly. "I thought you were the expert on games, Gary. Isn't that what your whole Salmon Whisper act is about?" Someone in the crowd, it sounded like old Mr. Peterson from the hardware store, called out. "Is it true about the city supplier, Gary? Have you been buying your fish all along?" The question opened the floodgates. Suddenly, everyone had something to say or ask. Years of Gary's carefully constructed reputation began unraveling faster than a cheap fishing line. Regular customers started questioning every purchase they'd ever made from his market. Fellow fishermen began recalling suspicious details they noticed but never mentioned. That explains why his fresh catch always looked so uniform. Remember when he claimed to catch salmon in December? No wonder he never let anyone come fishing with him. Mayor Thompson tried to restore order, but his calls for calm were drowned out by the growing commotion. The other judges huddled together, whispering urgently and throwing uncertain glances at their now disgraced colleague. The festival's careful schedule had been completely forgotten. In the midst of the chaos, I watched Rachel. She'd moved away from Gary, standing alone near her abandoned competition entry. Our eyes met across the crowd, and for a moment, I saw my Rachel, the one who used to organize oranges by size and leave silly notes on the coffee maker. She took a step toward me, then stopped, seeming to realize that we were well past the point of simple explanations or apologies. Sarah appeared at my side, her hand gripping my arm. "Well," she said quietly, "I guess the town has a new story to talk about at next year's festival. If Gary's still in business by then," someone nearby added with a snort. Gary had finally given up on defending himself, and was trying to make a dignified exit, which wasn't easy with half the town peppering him with questions about his supposed fishing expertise. His official judge badge was notably missing, probably slipped off during his initial shock at the recording. Rachel chose that moment to find her voice. "I can explain," she said, but her words were nearly lost in the commotion. She looked around desperately, perhaps realizing for the first time just how public this revelation had become. Everyone who had known about their deception but kept quiet, either out of respect or uncertainty, was now watching the truth explode in the most spectacular way possible. The festival coordinator, Mrs. Jenkins, was trying to salvage what she could of the competition. "Perhaps we should take a short break," she announced, her voice strained. "Refresh our drinks, gather our thoughts." But nobody was moving toward the refreshment table. The crowd had broken into small clusters, each group dissecting what they'd just witnessed. I could see phones out, no doubt spreading the story to those who hadn't been there to see it firsthand. In a town like Cedar Creek, news traveled fast, but scandal traveled at light speed. My special fish had finally run through its full recording, leaving an almost eerie quiet in its wake. I reached out and patted its stuffed head, oddly grateful to this inanimate object that had helped expose a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for months. "The mayor's probably going to have to disqualify all the entries now," Sarah mused, watching as the judging panel huddled with Mayor Thompson. "Can't very well continue with the head judge's reputation in tatters." I shrugged, surprisingly unbothered by the chaos I'd caused. "Sometimes you have to break something completely before you can see what it was really made of." Rachel was still standing by her competition entry, looking lost and small against the backdrop of the festival's cheerful decorations. Gary had managed to retreat to his truck, though a few persistent questioners followed him across the parking lot. The carefully maintained facade of their secret relationship had shattered completely, leaving them both exposed in the harsh light of small-town scrutiny. As I packed up my truth-telling fish, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. The truth was out, messy and uncomfortable as it might be, and there was no going back to the carefully constructed lies that had become our normal. The week following the Fish Fry Festival felt like watching a snow globe settle after being shaken. Pieces of the old normal slowly drifted down, but nothing landed quite where it had been before. Gary's fish market closed. Temporarily for renovations, though everyone knew it was more about renovation of reputation than building. The Salmon Whisperer article disappeared from his window, replaced by a plain, closed sign that seemed to mock all the grandiose claims it had once displayed. I didn't go home after the festival. Sarah insisted I stay in her guest room, and for once, I didn't argue. She and Tom took turns bringing me updates about the town's reaction, though I hardly needed them. Cedar Creek's gossip mill was working overtime, and you could hardly walk down the street without overhearing some version of what had happened. Rachel tried to contact me several times. She left voicemails that started with explanations and ended in tears. She sent texts that ranged from desperate apologies to angry accusations about my public humiliation of her. I read them all but didn't respond. After spending months listening to her lies, I wasn't ready to hear her truths yet. The talking fish became something of a local legend. Someone had recorded its performance on their phone, and the video made its rounds on social media. Local teens started using "salty like Gary's brine" as slang for getting caught in a lie. I heard the high school drama club was even planning to write a play about it for their spring production. 3 days after the festival, I finally went back to our house, my house now, I supposed. Rachel had packed most of her things and left her key on the kitchen counter, right next to the coffee maker where she used to leave her notes. The spice rack was still alphabetized, and her herb garden still needed watering. These small pieces of her felt like artifacts from a different life. Gary's wife returned from Oregon briefly to finalize their divorce and sell their house. I ran into her at the grocery store, where we shared an awkward moment in the seafood section. "I knew something was fishy," she said with a sad smile. "But I never thought it would end up like this." We ended up getting coffee and sharing our stories. There was something therapeutic about talking to someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be the last to know. A month passed. The town's excitement gradually died down, though the festival incident had earned its place in Cedar Creek's history of memorable scandals. Gary moved to the city, presumably to start fresh where his reputation hadn't been filleted in public. Rachel, I heard, was staying with her sister in another state, though she still owned the bookstore. Her assistant Jenny was managing it for now. I kept the talking fish. It sat in my garage, a silent reminder of how truth, like a well-placed lure, sometimes needs the right moment to be effective. Occasionally, when the house felt too quiet, I'd press the button and listen to those recordings not out of bitterness anymore, but as a reminder that even the most convincing lies eventually surface. Sarah suggested I try actual fishing, real fishing, not the kind that involves secret rendezvous and borrowed recipes. To my surprise, I found I enjoyed it. There was something peaceful about sitting by the lake, watching my line cut through the water. I never used that famous bench, though. Instead, I found my own spot, where the morning sun hit the water just right and the fish actually bit. One day, while I was packing up my gear after a morning of fishing, I found one of Rachel's old sticky notes stuck in my tackle box. It had a silly drawing of a fish and her familiar handwriting. "Gone fishing, back soon!" I smiled, appreciating the irony, and let the wind take it away. The next fish fry festival came around eventually. They made some changes, no more individual judges, just a panel of local restaurant owners. I entered again, this time with a genuinely caught and properly cooked fish. I won second place, fair and square. The prize was a gift card to the new seafood place that had opened in Gary's old location. People still ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled things, if there might have been a less public way to address the situation. Maybe there was. But in a town like Cedar Creek, where everyone knows everyone's business anyway, maybe the public nature of the revelation was fitting. After all, Rachel and Gary had made the whole town complicit in their deception. It seemed right that the whole town should be there to see it exposed. As for me, I'm doing fine. The house is quieter now, and the spice rack has lost its alphabetical order, but that's okay. I've learned that sometimes life's biggest catches come when you're not trying to fish at all. And while I may not be a salmon whisperer, I've gotten pretty good at recognizing when something smells fishy and, more importantly, at trusting that instinct when it hits. The talking fish still works, though its batteries are probably getting low. I'm thinking of donating it to the local museum. They're putting together an exhibit about significant moments in Cedar Creek's history. After all, every good fishing story needs some proof to back it up, even if the fish in question is stuffed with speakers instead of scales. If you enjoy, please like the video and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Have a nice day. See you soon.